data. I'm Scott Menzel, and I'm the Product and User Experience Manager here at GuideStar. Before we get started, I've got just a few housekeeping items I'd like to mention. First, we're going to be live tweeting during today's presentation. Use hashtag #FinancialScan. So please feel free to join the conversation on Twitter. Secondly, we are happy to take questions from all of you during the presentation. We'll answer as many as we can before our time is up. To submit a question, you can just use the Q&A feature on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If we get to all of your questions before our time is up, we'll post more of the answers on the GuideStar blog at trust.guidestar.org. And we will send all of you an email with a link to the presentation and today's recording in a few days. I'm happy to introduce Peter Kramer, a National Advisory Services Manager at the Nonprofit Finance Fund. Peter serves as the Nonprofit Finance Fund's National Consulting Team, supporting product development efforts and service delivery associated with NFF's national initiatives and partnerships. Peter, take it away.
Scott, and thanks to all of you for joining us for the webinar today. It's a pleasure to be with you. Let's begin with a look at how we'll spend our time together for the next hour. A few minutes of reorienting to the Form 990. It's something that we're all likely familiar with, and some folks in the audience probably even use 990s as a part of their grant-making process. But to get on the same page, we'll spend a little time on what the data can tell us and some of its benefits and limitations. To help bring that data to life, I'll take us through a case analysis of a fictional organization using FinancialScan, an approach reflective of how NFF conducts historical analyses in our client engagements. I'll highlight some of the ways that this information can be useful and actionable to grant makers as we move through the presentation. I'll then pull up the online interface of FinancialScan so you can get a sense of how the data can be generated. And then we'll fit up with your questions and our answers in the final minutes of the webinar. Let's get started. We all know that tax-exempt organizations are required to complete a Form 990 each year by a tax return within 5 months of an organization's fiscal year. This is in compliance with the IRS, and no surprise here, these are public documents. But that's not the whole story. As we see in practice, and as some of you know from direct experience, many funders and individual donors do look to Forms 990 as a primary form of due diligence. Is that even in the instructions for completing the Form 990, the IRS acknowledges this broader role of the Form 990 as a public profile. Resources like GuideStar help to make these forms available to a public audience, and as the sector grows in sophistication and as the trend toward transparency and data-driven decision-making accelerates in the sector, momentum is growing to make 990 data even more readily available, both in terms of the speed of the availability and of an accessible format for various kinds of users. In light of this larger role that the 990 plays beyond compliance, we'll spend our time today exploring how grant makers can put this data to better use. It's really available, as I mentioned, on a number of websites like GuideStar, and it can be used to help better understand an applicant or a grantee's recent financial dynamics as a part of the due diligence process. At NFF, we believe that a strong financial foundation is critical to supporting effective programs and then in turn produce positive outcomes and results in our communities. And given that these are public documents, there's also a communications opportunity for funders and nonprofits. 990 data can help be used to ground a conversation with information, with data, and gives us the ability to use numbers to inform the recent past is linked to current plans and resource needs that are part of the everyday grantor-grantee relationship. That said, I'd like to acknowledge that 990 data should not be the only component of a review of financial health. Audited financial statements can show greater detail and remain a widely accepted standard. However, 90 data has some advantages, including accessibility and the ability to compare. And the balance sheet information in particular on the Form 990 is especially strong, as we'll see in just a few minutes. So here's a look at what 90 data can and cannot help us understand. It can give a picture that is accurate of the past financial trends across the income statement and the balance sheet. It can also illuminate the dynamics across standardized fields that allow for comparison between organizations. No other format really provides for such a comparison, given that audits, budgets, other reports are so customized. The accessibility that funders often need in the diligence process really comes to light with the Form 990 and requires less of a burden on a nonprofit, but cannot provide the only source of financial information for an organization. Of course, those budgets, internal reports, and audited statements that I mentioned are still needed for the ongoing management of the organization. Some funders like to look at additional documents in their diligence process, and those often can provide a clearer picture of the most or real-time financial information. Just on the timeliness of 990 data, right when an organization closes its fiscal year, it is at its freshest. But by the time an organization files with the IRS, which can be, they have up to 4.5 to 5 months. The IRS gets that information out to web resources like GuideStar after several more months. Once GuideStar has it, they can digitize the data within 30 to 60 days. So the public profile might not be as fresh as it was previously. Also, the next point on here shows that specific line items might not track exactly between a Form 990 and a financial statement, but generally the larger totals of things like total revenue, total expenses, assets, those should be consistent across documents. Other points more specifically, and we'll be able to see these when we go to the case analysis in just a moment, is that the 990s provide a breakdown of net assets by donor-imposed restriction. We know that revenue and net assets can be unrestricted, temporarily restricted, or permanently restricted. Form 990, this distinction is not made in terms of revenue. It is on net assets, but not in terms of revenue. Also, 990s don't allow for the distinction between operating and non-operating activities. It really reflects the operating or day-to-day expenses, reliable expenses of an organization versus capital or episodic activities within an organization. So this isn't available on the Form 990, and actually it's not required in audits either, but it is a place where we do more commonly see a distinction between what an organization uses for its daily ongoing operations and the more episodic capital-like needs, oftentimes for facilities or a campaign, and you also might see some investment activities there. I'll introduce you to our guide for today's analysis, SCAN. A new data platform developed by NFF and GuideStar. I've been underwriting nonprofit loans and advising organizations on matters of strategic finance for more than 30 years, and we combined our financial analysis expertise with GuideStar's unmatched access to nonprofit data. We designed the SCAN to make the most out of what the 990 can offer by taking what can sometimes be an unintuitive compliance document and applying an analytical filter to the data to make it more accessible and useful for nonprofits and funders. The Financial SCAN data platform lives on GuideStar's website and automatically pulls data for reports with just a few clicks. You'll see that when I get to the demonstration following our case analysis. To give a multi-year perspective on nonprofit financial health, as well as the opportunity for a side-by-side analysis with up to peer organizations, that particular organization that's being analyzed. Important note on the data that you see caveated here in the asterisk is that SCAN is currently only able to pull data from the regular Form 990. not the 990 EZ, which can be filed by organizations who have revenue that is less than $250,000 a year. And we also don't have data available for the 990 PF. That's filed by private foundations. And the reason for that is really that those are different documents with different fields for Form 990. And in particular, the EZ requires much less information to be reported for these smaller organizations. And therefore, the amount of information we can glean for it is not quite as meaningful as what's available in the regular Form 990. That said, the universe of organizations available in Financial Scan is up of more than 313,000 organizations. So what's in the report? How do we actually show this information? And we'll look at some screenshots and move through our analysis here in just a second. But to lay groundwork, it's something that's available both online and in a PDF format. We have a couple of dashboards, one that shows 5 years of key financial trends and ratios for a particular organization. The dashboard, the peer comparison dashboard, looks at that side-by-side analysis of a relevant group of peers. These are available both online and in the PDF. Graphs and explanatory text, which look at these 5 areas that you see here in greater detail. In fact, we have 13 graphs in total, along with some educational narrative that corresponds to the graphs. That's only available in the PDF full report itself. With that, we'll dive into the meat of our webinar. This is of one organization's 990 data using Financial Scan. See a snapshot of our fictional organization for homeless youth. Their mission, you can see, is to provide homeless and at-risk youth with the resources, relationships, and skills to become self-sufficient. From the drop-in center, they deliver a number of different programs, including a pretty robust health services component, some case management for the various youth that use their services, and also some basic employment skills training. They say help to prepare them to help prepare youth to move from a life on the streets into a more self-sufficient living situation. Dealing with some of these dynamics that you see here, an increased demand for their services given the fiscal crisis, the 2009-2008 recession, and the protracted recovery that we've been experiencing. Over the period, they've also seen some uncertain revenue sources. And all the while, that drop center, which really provides a hub for all their services, has been aging. And so they're also thinking about how they can maintain the facility, which is so core to what they do. To give a little bit more background into the story, to share some more insights here. So helpfulness youth is roughly about $1 million in terms of its expense budget size. And following the 2008 financial crisis, they saw a growing need for their services in their own community, with more teens and young adults living on the streets. In response, they underwent a period of expansion. They hired new staff and forged ahead with a planned renovation of their aging drop-in center. To raise the revenue needed for new staff and the facility project, however, the growth has been unsustainable for them. The growth has come at an expense to their bottom line. In 2011, leadership made the painful but important decision to reduce expenses. The level of expanded operations to serve more youth was not sustainable. Let's look to see how the story I just shared with you has played out in terms of their finances and what we can see specifically in their 990 data. So we're looking at a screenshot of the Financial Scan dashboard and focusing on financial indicators from the income statement. It's organized by the categories of expenses, revenue, and profitability, and the most recent 5 years of data available on GuideStar. This is a screenshot, and we'll move to the online interface after we walk through this particular case example. So we see here several items that are relevant to the story that I told. We'll start with expenses. In the area that's highlighted with yellow, you can see the growth from about $800,000 up to $1 million, $1.1 million, and then a contraction in 2011 back down to $900,000, which represents about a 14% decrease in their expense base. Some might look at a decline in expenses like this as a sign of weakness or problems with the organization. And while it's true that it represents a correction, I would much rather see management take action to bring expenses in line with revenue than the organization fully deplete its reserves or dip into negative net assets. So, see that correction represents some responsive leadership and management. A little bit further to revenue, you'll notice that we show total revenue down here, which includes unrestricted and restricted dollars, and we look at the composition in terms of a percentage. So how much of their total revenue is represented by these different categories that are available in the Form 990. And when we get this, highlighting here shows that some of these sources have been consistent over time. As a Help for Homeless Youth funder, I might want to discuss this with the organization's leadership to better understand the environment that's contributing to revenue volatility and what the relevant internal and external factors are that are leading to, as we can see, some in government grants, but then a little bit contraction and then some growth again. Their general grants and contributions has been relatively consistent over time, so that's an area that they might want to build out, build from that core strength. They seem to reliably bring in funds there. We also see program service revenue has been relatively flat until it falls off in 2011. So understanding what some of the dynamics, whether internal or external to that, to the organization, could help to inform what I want to do as a grant maker. We move down the page a little bit further to look at profitability. So how do they do in a given year in terms of their operations? I mentioned earlier that Form 990 does not allow for distinction between restricted and unrestricted dollars and revenue. And the way we get around that is through measuring surplus or deficit or profitability on the balance sheet. So we believe that the more accurate perspective of what an organization has available for use in a given year is taking a look at its activities on an unrestricted basis. And given the confliction within the revenue categories, we instead measure profitability on the balance sheet, where we can see the change in unrestricted net assets from the end of the year less the restricted net assets at the beginning of the year. So the difference represents how the organization did on an unrestricted basis. And when we look at that for Help for Homeless Youth, we see some inconsistent surpluses over the period. This also shows us, and particularly in 2008, this dynamic very clearly of the inclusion of restricted revenue. So in 2008, we see total revenue of $1.1 million and expenses of about $850,000. So we might expect to see a pretty sizable surplus in that year. But we'll look at the change in unrestricted net assets and see a deficit. That tells us that much they brought that money in for in 2008 is actually purposes that were temporarily restricted by donor intent. And we'll see a little bit more clearly when we look at the balance sheet, but we can also start to pick up the signs here that 2007 and 2008 represent the years of their capital campaign. Remember the innovation of the drop-in center that I mentioned? The org took on that campaign in 2007 and 2008, which is marked by the large unrestricted surplus in 2007, and then the temporarily restricted dollars that we just looked at in 2008. And we'll see the capital improvement a little bit more clearly, as I mentioned in the balance sheet, in just a minute. But as a whole, when looking at the income statement piece of this, the numbers represent the accounting impact of the decisions that an organization makes. So that as a funder, when we hear, for example, about a cut in expenses, 990 data can really help illustrate what's behind that story and how the organization arrived there to help understand how we can, as a funder, support what the organization needs going forward. So let's take the balance sheet side now. Sheet is where we really see the facility investment that they made in their drop-in center manifest, and a few other important dynamics. From 2008 to 2009, it's very clear that there's a jump of about $120,000 in terms of the organization's gross buildings and equipment, which represents its fixed assets or its property and equipment. We also see, by looking at the dynamics here in the balance sheet section, is that liabilities as a percent of assets remained relatively flat. That tells us that they didn't take on debt to finance the facility expansion, which we could also intuit from looking at the increase in revenue from the capital campaign back on the income statement. What we also see is that accumulated depreciation, which is the accounting representation of the fixed asset's useful life, about 50%, even after they made that investment in the facilities. What it tells us is that there's some additional work they did to fully take care of, repair, replace things in terms of the organization's fixed assets. And those needs really still exist for the short and longer term. So, one of the things that I might want to see when I look at this organization is a plan for facilities, given that they are so important to the organization's mission. So we also see some other important balance sheet items here, like cash, and the increase in from 2007 and 2008, when the organization had some decent reserves of cash on hand that were linked to its facility project. Then over time, those start to decline as they invest the dollars into the facility, and then their assets are fixed and they experience some of those deficits. Their cash position is really constrained, and we see this also play out in the liquidity measures that we have down below. So in 2007, the organization has looked like they could be some adequate amounts of liquidity on hand, but when we compare that to 2011, those have decreased by almost half. So we measure liquidity here on Financial Scan by months of cash, and that helps us to understand what an organization would have in terms of resources available to use in operations. So how long would they be able to continue existing operations if new revenue came in and just relying on their reserves to continue operations? We show that across a couple different measures, each which tell us something slightly different. Remember, cash can have both unrestricted and temporarily restricted cash comprised in there. So to get a more unrestricted and truly available picture of what net assets the organization has available, we look at months of estimated unrestricted liquid net assets. It takes out any fixed assets, so it takes out the facility, it takes out any temporarily restricted dollars that are in there, and shows what's truly available for the organization's use in terms of liquid net assets. Interesting to look at these liquidity measures, because what we see in terms of net assets, which some organizations often look to, is that there's growth in net assets over the period generally, but the liquidity measures tell us a very different story. And the story here really is that it's crystallized as we look at these key financial indicators over the period, and we see these trends in a clear way, which can help to highlight some of their current resource needs, like prioritizing a dedicated facility reserve and building their liquidity back to procession levels to help ensure that Help for Homeless Youth has really robust ability to continue to advance its mission for the longer term. I mentioned here the peer comparison dashboard. here's a visual for our fictional case organization as compared to 5 of its peers. Help for Homeless Youth appears as organization number 1 in the shaded gray column. Now, I recognize that this screenshot has a lot of detail, and it might be hard for many of you, depending on your screen size, to read the actual numbers. I just have a visual up here while I speak to a few of the dynamics and trends that come in this particular comparison. So it pulls the most recent year of available 990 data for this side-by-side dashboard and shows the same comprehensive indicators that we looked at on our prior dashboard. This allows the user to contrast the different circumstances and stages of organizational development among peers and different kinds of choices that organizations have made in terms of their operations and balance sheets. It helps to put a single organization's numbers into the context of a relevant peer group. So, much of homeless youth organizations of generally comparable size in various geographies across the country in comparison with Help for Homeless Youth. Most organizations have grown recently, suggesting that Help for Homeless Youth's recent traction was somewhat unique among its peers. The most striking differences that I see when I look at these numbers is a wide variety, in fact, of revenue profiles across the group, relying more heavily on government grants and others relying primarily on private contributions and grants. Those different revenue drivers have very different implications for the way that an organization makes and spends its money and can mean different things for its ability to manage through challenging times. Like Help for Homeless Youth, most peers have sizable fixed assets, and these, this, of course, us that serving homeless people, especially homeless youth, requires a permanent home for us to serve their target populations, at least for this particular group. But unlike Help for Homeless Youth, liquidity, this peer group appears relatively healthy. This offers a marker for the level of resources that other comparable organizations have available, and it contributes to the case that additional reserves are needed for the organization. And with the right leadership, right strategy, and right fund relationships, Help for Homeless Youth could have the wherewithal to turn around its cash position and climb back to benchmark levels that we see a number of its peer organizations enjoy. It can be an interesting data point in conversations with the organization's leadership and also as an element of the grant-making process. And from this broader peer context, I'd like to back to look specifically at Help for Homeless Youth and dive into just a few of the graphs that we can see some of these dynamics that we've talked about a little more clearly in terms of a visual picture. All 3 of the most relevant ones with you now for Help for Homeless Youth, but also give a sense of the list of topics that are analyzed in the detailed graphs that accompany the dashboard in Financial Scan. And as I mentioned, the narrative and explanation and reflection questions for each of these topic areas are paired with the respective graphs. So if you're looking at a screenshot of what is an NFF favorite in terms of a graph, so we had to make sure to include it in Financial Scan. What we call the full costs of doing business, and based on the idea that in addition to day in and day out operating expenses, there are costs that don't hit the income statement, but nonetheless require cash. Full costs will help to sustain an organization over the longer term. And these can take into account balance sheet items, including purchases of fixed assets, debt principal payments if the organization has loans or other liabilities, and contributions to savings. For most organizations, covering all full costs in every given year is aspirational. Nonetheless, we recommend that organizations set revenue targets high enough to contribute toward full cost coverage. The graph here starts with expenses, the green bar, and there's on components of full cost. So more specifically, the dark green bar, I should say, for operating expenses. Then we have on top of the stack depreciation, debt principal, fixed asset purchases, and an estimate of 1 month of savings. Black line then shows estimated unrestricted revenue, which can be used to cover these full costs. In 2007, black line was above the stacked bar, showing us that Help for Homeless Youth had enough unrestricted revenue to cover its full costs. But as the organization expanded and executed its facility improvement, the full costs were not covered, with the stacked bars exceeding the black line. An implication of Help for Homeless Youth not covering its full cost is that decrease in liquidity that we saw on the dashboard, and is that represented again here in our next graph. Asset composition is shown here, and we don't need to spend too much time, but it maps visually some of the things that we saw when we looked back at the balance sheet component of the dashboard. Over time, the organization's assets have grown increasingly fixed with and buildings and equipment, or their exhibit facility through the renovation of their drop-in center, shown here by the purple bars. And its assets have grown decreasingly liquid, shown here by the dark red cash bar. The organization's investment in facility and its depletion of its cash show how its composition of assets has become more fixed, less liquid, which restricts leadership's ability to be flexible in terms of finances. For profits, the facility can really be a critical piece of how they advance their missions, and that's certainly the case with Help for Homeless Youth. Their drop-in center is really the nexus of how they engage with youth, giving them a safe place to get out of the weather and get access to services. That facility ownership is its own line of business and can sometimes be odds with other organizational needs that require money when we need to fix the hot heater, for example, rather than an additional person or maintain appropriate levels of liquidity. Dedicated facility reserve that is governed by the board of directors can help to steward fixed assets responsibly and address periodic needs for repairs and replacements. And speaking of the liquidity and the reserve side for Help for Homeless Youth, this last graph that we'll look at before moving on, more specifically how the various measures of liquidity that we saw on the balance sheet have moved downward over time. There's no right amount for liquidity in terms of a one-size-fits-all for nonprofit organizations. Truly appropriate amount is what is available and allows organizations to be resilient, adaptable, and responsive to the changing needs of its mission. And that's influenced by a number of dynamics, including the current economic climate, their stage of development or their life cycle, whether they're embarking on growth and need to have large amounts of upfront reserves that they can then spend down during their period of growth, or a campaign. Also, if an organization relies heavily on funding sources that can be delayed, as sometimes government agencies might be, then they might want to have a larger amount of cash on hand to act as an internal line of credit while they bridge that period. So there are a variety of factors that go into the right amount of liquidity for organizations. That said, we've seen that groups, in practice, really need at least 3 months of cash, unrestricted cash, that is, on hand to feel some level of breathing room. So all this mean, there's a number of ways, right, which this information can be used for the leadership of the organizations, but now that we've seen what the data tells us about Help for Homeless Youth, how might funders use this information? How can we include this in our grant-making practice? And having managed through the last few years, much of the information that Financial Scan shows won't be a surprise to Help for Homeless Youth's leadership. And a funder with a close relationship might also be aware of the situation through an ongoing dialogue with the organization, which is always best. A dialogue just really helps to illuminate what's going on. However, looking at the 990 data does provide a clear visual articulation of the organization's trajectory, how its broader story has played out financially, helping to make the case for future plans. Here's that Help for Homeless Youth funders could use this information to take action. First, they can use 90 data or a tool like Financial Scan to focus financial due diligence. Use this data as a starting place to clarify which areas dynamics are most important for further analysis and conversation. Of course, there are other elements to consider in due diligence, like organization's outcomes, its market position, the effectiveness of its leadership, and so on. But as I mentioned earlier, we really believe that effective organizations require strong finances, and taking a look at this information can be helpful in the grant-making process. But beyond that, having a conversation with an organization's leadership that is based in data can be very helpful. As I mentioned, no financial analysis is really complete without a conversation with the people who have been living actual realities of the numbers and can add important nuance to the story. Third, the can incorporate the financial data into a conversation with leadership in the grant decision process, ties to the final point of funders then considering addressing some of the most crucial needs that come out in looking at the data for longer-term health and vibrancy, supporting the full costs of business, for example, and or helping to build an adaptive organization through robust and responsibly managed reserves. So these steps can help to ground today's grant-making in the context and lessons from an organization's recent financial past. So having said all that and moved through our case analysis, I'd like to share with you the online interface just to give you an idea of how this information can be generated. We're now going to the honors of the financial scan report. This is again accessed through GuideStar's website and has a number of search features that you might be familiar with if you do use GuideStar. We can search using the name of the organization, or if we'd like more criteria that can help to narrow the field, we can look at revenue, expenses, state, city, and subsector as well. For a moment, I'm going to look at Big Brothers Big Sisters. I'm going to look at Boys and Girls Clubs. And I happen to know, and apologies, I've signed out of GuideStar for a moment. Give me just 1 second while I sign back in. I apologize, and I'll just be right back once I'm signed in. Apparently, too much time in the case analysis, and I got logged off. All right. I'm back there, folks. Apologies for the delay. All right. I hope you can again see my screen. I've now found the search results for Boys and Girls Club, and I know that the one that I'm looking for is actually in Phoenix. So I'm going to use some of these tools on the right to narrow my search. And that'll pull up the groups relevant to Phoenix. So I'm going to select the organization, which pulls up the dashboard. So this is the online version of the screenshots that we saw. Here you can link to the Forms 990 that are represented here. You can click on some definitions and formulas for each of the line items that are present in the dashboard, as well as access some additional context through these information icons in the dashboard. You can also print just this page by clicking on this PDF icon. We then can select peer organizations and search specifically by name, or you can use the tools like revenue, expenses, assets, sector to find a broader subset if you don't know exactly which organizations you're looking for. So select a number of different peers, just to get a sense of what this looks like. And then we'll take a look at the peer comparison dashboard. Just for the sake of time, I'm just select 3 peers, but as I mentioned, you can select up to 5. And depending on the kind of analysis you're looking to do, it can influence how you choose peers. Maybe you're interested in looking at certain organizations that are in a relevant subsector like homeless services within a given geography. Other times you might want to compare to different organizations across the country, or maybe aspirational organization. So what kind of organization does this target organization want to be like? What differences between a smaller group and a larger, more mature organization? Here we are on the peer comparison dashboard, and we can see the most recent year of data that's available and being pulled into this side-by-side comparison. And this here tells us which organizations are in which columns. And the data is actually, again, pulling straight from GuideStar's database and shows a number of the same indicators from the dashboard that we looked at. And, the next phase, and again, we can do a single-page PDF right from here, but the step in the process, which can get us the full report, including the graphs, can be done just by clicking here on Generate Report. Annual subscriptions, the interface automatically saves your reports online, so you can access them at later points as well. And here we have the PDF, which includes, I mentioned, the dashboard, a number of additional graphs that show further detail, and also some narrative in terms of the context of what dynamics you might be seeing here. Some more specifics on categories is shown here. Here's our full cost graph for the Boys and Girls Club in Phoenix. And a number of other revenue composition graphs, and moving on through balance sheet items here as well, through a full complement of data for this organization. Here we have your comparison, and lastly the appendix, which includes the definitions and calculations for each of the line items, pulls with this as well. Sample report on our website and on Guide's website if you'd like to see this in greater detail. So I'm going to go back to our slides, and we'll shortly move into the Q&A portion. But before we do that, I wanted to just thank you all again for joining us. And if you've enjoyed the presentation today, if you think that financial scan and using 990 data could be a helpful thing to incorporate in your grant making practice, we'd love to offer you this particular discount for folks who are joining us today on the webinar. When you purchase Financial Scan online on GuideStar's website, you can use this promotional code. So take a moment to jot down. And please do so by the end of June. The 28th is when the offer does expire. But again, it's annual access for an unlimited amount of reports. You can search as many organizations as you like, run as many reports as you like for the single subscription, which is done through this offer at $2,000. We've got about 15 minutes left for questions, so we'd love to hear from you all what's on your minds and what questions you have about look at 990 data and Financial Scan more specifically.
Thank you. We just have a couple of questions here, unless some filter in near the tail end. We have a question about the integration of 990 EZ data, which I know that the project currently doesn't integrate 990 EZ data. I think something that's on our radar. You might be able to get a little bit more into the details of and what types of data is available within a 990 EZ. That makes it somewhat problematic to integrate into the Financial Scan reports.
Yeah, of course, it's a great question, and as we know, most organizations in the nonprofit sector, the million-plus organizations that are out there, are small and may file a Form 990 EZ. That the EZ is really a different document. It has different fields. It has a more limited set of information that groups are required to report on. Because of that, it doesn't give us the level of detail and some of the richness that the full regular Form 990 gives. Because of that, we chose also just the issue of reconciling for some organizations who might fluctuate on that line of $250,000, and some years file an EZ, some years file a regular Form 990. Chose to focus just on those that file regular Forms 990 because of the meaningful information that we're able to get, whereas we just might not be able to provide as robust an analysis using the more limited information that's available in a Form 990 EZ.
Right. There was a question around, assessing the financial health of organizations based on, within 5 years. One specific question that I had that I got was an organization with 1 or 2 years worth of digital 990 data. And say that an organization with 2 or more years of 990 data, they're sort of, for lack of a better term, eligible for a FinScan financial scan report to be generated. With one, I think because of the trading analysis of the financial scan product, we just, the product does not allow for a single year.
That's exactly right, Scott.
Okay. A lot of questions about peers. Some of these questions had filtered in prior to your live demo of the product, but I think that maybe some of them are worth reiterating. The questions around peer selection, is it possible to choose to pick which peers you're comparing? And as you demonstrated, yes, you can select up to 5, based on any number of criteria. And just to reiterate, the criteria is that generally you can look up by organization name or keyword. Generally useful if you know the particular peers that you're looking for, and any of the other sort of the criteria that you outlined in the online demo, NTEE code, city, state, total assets, total income, total revenue, total expenses can be used to identify peers that a user might not know by name.
Right.
We had one, yeah.
I'm seeing some other questions coming in.
Just trickling in, yeah.
Yeah. So one that I'd love to address is this question about red flags or patterns that are causes for concern when looking at 990 data. And specifically, the question asks about compensation of key employees or executives as a percentage of total information. Organization typically, we do in the nonprofit sector is often very bull-intensive and people-oriented. So it's very common for the largest expense component for any organization to be personnel expenses. The scan doesn't get into the depth of showing executive compensation. That information is available on Forms 990. So, we don't have measures of red flags for percentages of key employees or executives relative to total expenses. What I say is that, we skilled people to do this work, and it's something that, of course, should be kept to appropriate levels, but that's not something that Financial Scan specifically gives us the ability to look into. In terms of broader red flags or patterns, some of the things that I really look for are reliable revenue sources, also looking for consistent surpluses over time. They just show good management. That said, a periodic deficit from time to time, if it's reasonably small relative to the size of the organization's budget, that's part of the business of running organizations, and many for-profits experience that as well. Also, liquidity is very key. It represents an organization's ability to be responsive and adaptive. Those are some things that I might specifically look at. But I mentioned a conversation is so important that we didn't build into this any automatic rate or rankings, because we think that doing so could possibly misrepresent what's on when a conversation with leadership could really give the nuance and detail that can help to give a more robust understanding of the organization's realities.
Right. The other question, just regarding the product itself, are there any limits on the number of financial scan reports you can generate in a year when subscribing to annual subscription? And the answer is no. There's no limit. You can run as many as you'd like. Question on the dashboard: where does the estimated unrestricted net assets come from? Peter, I believe that's a discrete value, but
yeah, so it's not actually a field or a line item on the 990. It's something that we calculate as a part of the financial scan. And as I mentioned when we were working through the case example, it really represents what is unrestricted and liquid and available for management to use. So taking out any temporarily restricted dollars and taking out facility-related assets. So the number actually comes from taking restricted net assets, removing the value of facilities and facility-related debt, and that leaves us with unrestricted assets, which are free and available for use for an organization in terms of their reserves and their liquidity.
Got it.
I see a question here, Scott, about an individual scan versus an annual subscription. It's a good question, given that our audience is, for this webinar in particular, is institutions and Grantmakers. The subscription is $2,500. A single financial scan that we have discounted for nonprofit users is $250. It was done so that groups would have, really accessible, access really to the financial scan report. $250 gets an organization the ability to run a report on a single organization, mostly itself, but then as many peer comparisons that it would like within a 48-hour period. So $250 gets you 48-hour access to run a report on a single organization, and that's something that we've seen a number of nonprofits take advantage of. It's another piece. We did a version of this presentation and analysis tailored for a nonprofit audience just earlier today.
And I think that there are some, there were questions that maybe have been filtered in through some nonprofits that may have been on this call. And then forgive me for if I missed this, Peter, but there's also some questions about the cost of that. And the cost of the individual scan, financial scan, is $250. And you may have said that, I just missed it. And just to reiterate what you said, that gives an organization 48 hours to run their own report, their own organization's report, as many different combinations of peers as they need to within the 48-hour window. Yep.
I see a follow-up question to the explanation that I just gave about unrestricted months of cash, months of liquid net assets versus cash. Remember that cash is comprised of both unrestricted cash and cash is temporarily restricted by donor intent. So they have the money in the door in terms of accrual counting, but it is not available for use until it satisfies a donor imposed restriction, which can either be imposed by time or by purpose. So it might be for example capital campaign, and so once they execute on it, they can access that cash, or it might be for it's a time restriction where a grantor might make a multi-year gift, and so the money might hit the books in terms of accrual accounting in the first year, but there are additional dollars that aren't available until the second or third year. So those kind of restrictions do still apply to cash. Not all cash is unrestricted. So that we offer the look at unrestricted net assets, unrestricted liquid net assets, to give a more focused presentation of what's really available, and oftentimes organizations that is lower because of the presence of temporarily restricted dollars.
Good. Just got another question in regarding the dates of the most recent year for peers, given the various timing differences, fiscal year end differences, and extensions. What we've in the interface and the comparable analysis report is the most recent fiscal year, which data is represented within the report for each peer organization and the target organization. So at least that's noted in the comparables analysis.
Yeah, that's right. Saw another question come in asking to share a list of subscribers to the annual subscription for Financial Scan. There is a list of some of our earliest adopters on GuideStar's website, I believe. So perhaps with the follow-up email, we can send a specific link to that page. It does not represent all of our subscribers, but it does show some folks who adopted earliest. We do people to opt in, and not everyone has opted in necessarily, depending on their own preferences. So it is an incomplete list and geared a little bit more towards some of our earliest adopters, but we can certainly see if we can include a link to that information in the follow-up email.
Right, good. Question just came in about if the product has the ability, if the user has the ability to select particular years for Financial Scan, or does it only include the most recent? At this point, it only includes the most recent for every organization, so the target and the peers within the report. So it's recent by default.
Great. I see a question from someone asking if there's a way to determine if their organization is already subscribed. Of course, drop me an email. Contact information is here, or give me a call, and I'd be happy to have that conversation with you. I think another question, too, about international grant-making organizations. This is really driven by groups that file a Form 90 in the U.S., and some international organizations do that, not all. But the question is also about building out some additional capacity around financial analysis in terms of resources and tools can help to include that as a part of the grant-making process for this funder who supports international organizations. Check NFF's website. You can go to nff.org, and we've got a number of resources there. You can see what kind of workshops we do offer, and you can certainly contact me if you'd like to talk about something specific that you might have in mind. We'd love to customize something for you.
And I think we're right up against it here, but there's one last question, and it's a pretty good one. Is there a way to be notified when the most recent financial year data is populated for an organization on which a scan has already been run? At this point in time, no, but that is very high up on our priority list. In fact, we hope to have the ability to do that, within a reasonable time frame. So that's been high on our radar for some time now.
Any other last questions before we wrap it up, Scott?
That's it. So with that, thank you, Peter, for taking the time here today. We really appreciate it. For all of you on the phone, thanks so much for being with us. The next GuideStar webinar is on June 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and it'll be on fundraising with social media. You can register at guidestar.org/webinars. And again, if we didn't get to your question, I think we got to most of them, but if we didn't, please check our blog at trust.guidestar.org for additional answers, and keep an eye out for the email coming soon with the link to the presentation and the recording. And have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Everyone.